Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
The time is just gone 8:34 a.m. It's time now to focus on Syria, and we have learned about the UN raising $6.4 billion for Syrians as the dire need for humanitarian needs arise. Now, we've also learned about 24 million people who require basic needs or basic aid. And this obviously has risen by 4 million over the last year. And we're joined on the line this morning by Ibtihal Bsis, who is a barrister joining us out of the United Kingdom. Sister Ibtihal, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jummah Mubarak to you.
Allah barak fiik.
Yes, as always, we appreciate your time with us here on Salam Media on News and Views. And we have now learned about the situation in Syria, obviously getting worse. Now, you and I have spoken about this in the past, but learning that, people that require basic aid has now risen by 4 million in a single year.
Yes, indeed, it has. And it's probably more than that because we're only getting the official statistics. So we're saying that 1 million have been displaced. It's much more than that. You can see that as soon as you come in through the border, I would have thought, and just reports from on the ground. So, and now they're being dealt a blow of coronavirus, and the regime is actually hitting hospitals and medical centers, and we know in the past it's murdered doctors that have dared to help the refugees. So they have really constrained the area. They've shut down borders, which they are not in control of, in order to stop that medical aid to get through. And also a lot of these Western countries, we talk about the UN now giving money, a lot of these Western countries have actually stopped charity workers going over to Syria. We know one of them who comes from Britain himself. His name is Brother Takwir. His citizenship has been revoked by the British government, and he has done no more but settle in Syria in order to help in that charitable way. So we can see there's a drive, which doesn't make sense really, because on the one hand, you've got the UN who are supplying money to the Syrians who are fighting a revolution, which now people say is a war. And on the other, they're stopping citizens, their own citizens, from traveling to Syria in order to help on the ground. I've certainly, as a lawyer, represented some charity workers who have had their passports stopped, not their citizenship revoked, but they're not able to apply for a new passport, and they've been told by the government to wait, and that is purely because they are going over and helping people. That's what's happening.
Yes. Obviously, from what you've just described, it doesn't make sense. On the one hand, people who are NGOs and people who are rendering assistance to the Syrians, obviously action being taken by their own governments. But on the other hand, the UN speaks about this desperation, about this dire need. And I'm not too sure, Sister Ibtihal, they're talking about 6.4 billion that have been pledged. But how much of that money is actually reaching the Syrian people?
That's a very good question. And if we look at, in 2018, The Guardian reported that Bashar al-Assad, when he found out that the UN was sending money, he said to them that you can't give it unless the charities have been registered in Damascus. So where is the money going? There's been exactly the same situation in 2020 when actually Russia intervened and closed the border with Iraq. And said to them, well, you can't come in through this way. So the UN would have had to go through another way. And of course, the Syrian and Russian forces were there waiting for this money, this aid to be given. Look, it doesn't make sense. Always when the UN gives money, there's a political agenda, and it's a very clear political agenda. And we will see a report once this money has been given, which is less, incidentally, than the money last year and the money before that. Britain alone has given much less than it has done in the past. So they're making a show about this, but really the money is less, and we know it's not got to the people that that need it now, especially with the coronavirus outbreak. So, and we know that the UN has been inept, completely inept in Syria. We don't need money. Syria doesn't need money. We need a new political system. We need the removal of Bashar al-Assad completely. Look, let's think back to 2003. What is it that America did in Iraq? They went in, they said there's weapons of mass destruction. When there wasn't, they said, well, it was a good thing we removed Saddam Hussein. So why aren't they able to remove a man who has a smaller army, much smaller army, lot less power, a lot less money? Why aren't they able to remove him? And that's because he serves a political agenda for them. It's to their benefit. So it's the same thing in Libya. The Europeans sent in NATO in Libya, and look at the mess that they've created there. And really, you just have to follow where the benefit of America and other big states are. You just have to follow that to understand. So we know in Iraq it was oil. We know in Libya it was oil. And in Syria is in a very strategic place. It's on the border with Israel, let's not forget. And he's serving the interests of the big superpowers there, because obviously he's a friend to Israel. So they don't want our states to be united. So they'll talk about giving aid and giving money. Why have you come 10 years too late? People have died in the process, and they are very, very good at ensuring that they follow the trail of where money goes, if it's coming from individuals, if it's coming from Muslims. But when it comes to their own money, they're not able to follow the trail. I find this impossible to believe. I find it very hard to believe. So there's clearly a political agenda at play here.
Well, certainly, and over and above the political agenda, Sister Ibtihal, there is this commercial, there is this financial agenda. Because on the one hand, the UN talks about death, they talk about destruction, they talk about displacement, disease, and all of it. And we've also learned about financial institutions, the banking industry, talking about lending this money to the donors, whether it's at low interest loans or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, we see this whole commercialization of a disaster, of the displacement, of the death, the destruction of the Syrian people, and at the end of the day, people profiteering, people commercializing this entire sad state of affairs in Syria.
Yes, no money that comes from the West is free. I remember seeing a very distinguished program here called Question Time, in which one of the conservative ministers said, when he was being asked a question by the audience, that, you know, charity begins at home. We need to stop giving money to people abroad. We need the money here. And he said, look, we don't give something for nothing. And he just said it very, very quickly, but it tells you what's going on. Yes, the banks have loaned money to the UN on low interest rates, they called it. So, it's not going to be as exuberant as the IMF loans, but we still, and who's going to pay it back? Who is going to pay it back? And really, Syria is in big trouble because we know the economic system there has completely collapsed. There are now 222 Syrian pounds to the dollar. It used to be something like 90 something, I think 92 when I was there in 2014. So it's completely collapsed. And so much so that the revolutionaries at the border, the people who are anti-regime, are actually using Turkish dinars, then Turkish liras. They're not using the Syrian pounds. And who's going to pay this money? We know that Russia, Putin, is now knocking on the door of Bashar al-Assad, saying to him, you've got to pay me back for this war. And ultimately, we know Bashar al-Assad is not going to pay this money back. We know that the economic system has collapsed. We know that the people, not only would they have lost their lives and lost their relatives and lost their homes, lost everything, lost any dignity, they're now being told that they have to pay this money. Look, I read a report recently of a 72-year-old man who's gone back to work. Who's gone back to work carrying loads on his back in order to facilitate a living for himself, 72. And I know Bashar al-Assad will be coming after his people, taxing them even more than they can, working them harder more than they can. And they feel helpless and hopeless because they know what a revolution means. 10 years of war, 10 years of onslaught. So really, we know what's going on here. It's not that the that the superpowers and Europe is being specifically asked to give money to the UN. Because if you have any doubt about that, look at the way they're treating refugees in their own country. Denmark is telling Syrian women that they can go back with money or they can stay in a detention center. And it's a rock and a hard place, really. Look at the way Britain is treating refugees. Look at the way France is treating Muslims, their own citizen, Muslim French citizens, how they're treating them. And if anyone has any doubt, we just have to look at that. This has a very clear political agenda, and we need to wake up to that. We need to understand that.
Yes, and while all the suffering continues, it's basically with Ramadan coming up as well, and we've seen efforts intensifying, and mainly as a result of non-governmental organizations, particularly Muslim aid organizations, obviously who are obviously at the forefront of intensifying the efforts to bring some sort of relief, Sister Ibtihal, to the plight of the Syrian people. Yes, I think obviously we have lost connection, but this obviously gives us a very, very powerful, a very, very profound message. We see Sister Ibtihal obviously has frozen, but we have got we've got the message very, very strongly as far as the United Nations is concerned, and particularly looking at this announcement that was made about 6.4 billion of humanitarian aid that has been pledged. And the key question here is how much of that 6.4 billion is going to be reaching the people of Syria. The time is just gone 8:45 a.m. When we come back, we'll be joined by Maulana Ahmed Mohammadi, and we'll be looking at the Jummah Nasiha this morning.